Urban exploring had been our obsession since high school. The thrill of venturing into the unknown, the allure of dark, decrepit places. It was a rush like no other. Our group, Evelyn, Marcus, Rachel, Trevor, and me, Jonah, had explored countless forgotten factories, derelict hospitals, and even an abandoned amusement park. But nothing had prepared us for the pull of Hollow Creek Asylum. One late night, we were gathered in my basement, the air thick with the smell of old beer and the soft hum of idle chatter. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb, casting eerie shadows on the walls as we shared stories of our latest adventures. "Ever heard of Hollow Creek?" Marcus asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. He was leaning against the old, worn-out couch, his eyes glinting with a mixture of excitement and something else. Fear, maybe. Evelyn rolled her eyes. "The haunted asylum?" "Yeah, every town has one of those." "No, seriously," he insisted, leaning forward. "This place is different. Locals say the patients never left. And there was this doctor, Aldridge. Supposedly, he experimented on them, trying to find some kind of cure for death." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. We'd heard plenty of ghost stories, but something in Marcus's voice hinted at more than just folklore. He pulled out his phone and showed us grainy photos of the asylum, a massive Gothic structure surrounded by an overgrown forest. The windows were shattered, and the gates were rusted and barely hanging on. "Look," he said, passing his phone around. "We've been to plenty of creepy places, but this is the real deal." The images were enough to send a shiver down my spine. The asylum looked like something out of a nightmare. Its decaying grandeur a stark reminder of its dark past. Despite the eerie stories and the locals' warnings, we made up our minds. One night in Hollow Creek, documenting every chilling moment, was too good, or too terrifying, to pass up. We arrived at dusk. The sky was a bruised purple, casting long shadows over the asylum. The place was a hulking mass of decay and despair, its Gothic architecture looming like a beast ready to swallow us whole. The iron gates creaked ominously as we pushed them open, stepping into the overgrown courtyard. The air was thick with the scent of mold and something else. Something rotten. I pointed the camera at the building, the red light blinking in the gathering gloom. "This is it, guys. Hollow Creek Asylum. Let's make this count." Inside, the asylum was a nightmare of crumbling walls and rusted medical equipment. Dust hung in the air like a shroud, disturbed only by our footsteps and the occasional scuttling of unseen creatures. Every corner seemed to whisper secrets, and the temperature felt unnaturally cold. "Jesus, it's like walking into a horror movie," Rachel muttered, her voice echoing in the empty corridor. We set up our gear in what must have once been the main lobby. The ceiling was high, its paint peeling like old skin. An old reception desk stood in the center, covered in decades of grime. Evelyn and I took the west wing, while Marcus, Rachel, and Trevor took the east, each of us armed with walkie-talkies and our cameras. The deeper we went, the more the asylum seemed to come alive. The first odd thing I noticed was the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too persistent, too coherent, like voices just out of earshot. Then came the cold drafts, sudden and chilling, making us shiver despite the summer heat outside. Shadows seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on our eyes. "Evelyn, check this out," I said, focusing the camera on an old photograph pinned to a wall. It showed Dr. Aldridge with a group of patients, their faces scratched out violently. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. I was about to comment when our walkie-talkies crackled to life. "Guys, you need to see this." Marcus's voice was tense. "We're in the basement. It's messed up down here." We regrouped and headed down to the basement. The descent felt like a journey into the bowels of the earth itself. The narrow stairs creaked under our weight, and the air grew colder and more oppressive with each step. The smell of decay hit us first, a pungent mix of mold, rot, and something else. Something metallic and sharp that clawed at the back of our throats. The basement was a chamber of horrors. Flickering our flashlights around, we revealed scenes that could have been ripped straight from a nightmare. Old medical records lay strewn across the floor, yellowed pages detailing patients' suffering in meticulous, cruel detail. Rusted surgical instruments, their edges still glinting menacingly, were scattered among the debris, hinting at the tortures they once inflicted. "This place is a fucking tomb," Trevor whispered, his voice trembling. "Look at this," Marcus said, picking up a journal from a toppled shelf. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, and the pages within were filled with Dr. Aldridge's meticulous handwriting. The experiments detailed were ghastly, attempts to cheat death through methods that were as brutal as they were futile. As I read over Marcus's shoulder, the sense of being watched grew stronger, as if the very walls were imbued with the spirits of those who suffered here. A sudden noise made us all jump. It started as a faint rustling, like dry leaves skittering across the floor, but quickly escalated. Objects began to fly off the shelves, propelled by some unseen force. Papers swirled in a cyclone of chaos, and glass jars shattered against the walls, their contents, mysterious, murky substances, splashing across the floor. "Jesus Christ!" Rachel screamed, ducking as a heavy book barely missed her head. The air seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy. A chair lifted off the ground, hovered for a heartbeat, and then launched itself across the room, crashing into a cabinet with a deafening bang. Panic surged through us like an electric shock. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Evelyn's arm and pulling her towards the stairs. We bolted, our footsteps pounding against the concrete, echoing like gunshots. The basement seemed to resist our escape, the very air thickening around us as if trying to hold us back. We burst into the main hall, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. The oppressive feeling of the basement lingered, wrapping around us like a suffocating shroud. We collapsed onto the dusty floor, our backs against the crumbling walls. For a moment, the only sounds were our ragged breaths and the distant creaks of the old buildings settling around us. I glanced at the others, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The reality of what we were dealing with was sinking in, the thrill of exploration giving way to genuine terror. We huddled together to review the footage we had captured. The flickering images on the camera screen revealed ghostly figures, fleeting and shadowy, their forms barely distinguishable in the gloom. Strange laughter echoed faintly in the background, a chilling counterpoint to the silence of the asylum. The temperature around us continued to drop, the cold seeping into our bones. Marcus leaned forward, his face illuminated by the eerie glow of the screen. This is real," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've documented something truly paranormal." Despite the growing fear gnawing at our resolve, a silent agreement passed between us. We had come this far, uncovered this much. To turn back now, to leave without understanding what we had stumbled upon, felt impossible. The asylum seemed to breathe with a life of its own as we ventured deeper into its decaying heart. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the shadows, felt like a whisper from the past, urging us to turn back. But curiosity, that ever-present lure, kept us moving forward. The West Wing, where Evelyn and I headed, was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and darkened rooms. Our flashlights cut through the thick darkness, revealing glimpses of the asylum's haunting history. Rusted bed frames, decayed mattresses, and broken wheelchairs lay scattered, silent witnesses to the suffering that had once filled these halls. The wallpaper was peeling away in long, jagged strips, revealing the stained and moldy plaster beneath. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and each breath felt heavy in my lungs. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the silence, punctuated only by the occasional distant drip of water. "Evelyn, over here," I called softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. I had found another photograph, this one more disturbing than the last. It depicted a group of patients in what appeared to be a therapy session. their faces twisted in expressions of agony and despair. Dr. Aldridge stood behind them, his face obscured by a shadow. Evelyn shivered as she looked over my shoulder. "This place is hell on earth," she muttered, her breath visible in the frigid air. We moved on, the sense of unease growing with each step. The cold drafts were more frequent now, chilling us to the bone despite the summer heat outside. The whispers, too, had grown louder, more insistent, as if trying to communicate something just beyond our understanding. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. It was a distinct sound, not just the usual creaks and groans of the old building, but a faint, rhythmic tapping. "Yeah," she replied, her eyes wide with fear. "It's coming from up ahead." We followed the sound, our flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The tapping grew louder, leading us to a heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway. The door was massive, with intricate carvings that were now worn and barely visible. I reached out to push it open, but it swung inward on its own, revealing a room bathed in an unnatural, greenish glow. Inside, we found a makeshift operating room. The center of the room was dominated by a large, blood-stained table, surrounded by an array of rusted surgical tools. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with grotesque specimens, the preserved remains of Aldridge's horrific experiments. "Evelyn, look at this," I said, pointing to a journal lying open on the table. The pages were filled with Aldridge's meticulous notes, detailing procedures that were both horrifying and impossible. She leaned in to read, her face pale. "He was trying to transplant souls," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He believed he could trap them in new bodies, cheat death." A sudden chill ran through the room, and the green glow intensified. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in on us. We heard the whispers again, louder and more frantic, as if the spirits of Aldridge's victims were trying to warn us. "Evelyn, we need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We were trapped. Panic set in, and we pounded on the door, trying to force it open. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the green glow casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, and the temperature plummeted. "Jonah, look!" Evelyn shouted, pointing to the center of the room. The blood-stained table had begun to vibrate, the surgical tools rattling against its surface. Slowly, a ghostly figure began to materialize above it, a transparent apparition of a young woman, her face contorted in pain. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the small room. "Please help me." I felt a surge of pity and terror as I watched the spectral figure. This must have been one of Aldridge's victims, trapped in the asylum even in death. But before I could react, the figure vanished, leaving us in stunned silence. "Did you see that?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to find the others. Now." We managed to force the door open and stumbled back into the hallway, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. And as we ran, the whispers followed us, echoing through the corridors, urging us to leave. I found myself alone in the dark corridor. The camera's light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I struggled to keep the camera steady. "Evelyn! Marcus! Anyone!" My voice echoed through the empty hallway. The walkie-talkie crackled, but there was no response. The building seemed to shift, the layout changing as if it were alive. Doors that had been open were now locked, and hallways twisted into confusing mazes. The spirits grew more aggressive, and their anger palpable. I stumbled back to the main hall, my hands shaking. The others were there, their faces pale. "We need to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "This place is evil." In the darkness, we heard a voice. "You cannot leave. This is your new home." All the doors slammed shut, and the lights went out. The camera's night vision clicked on, casting everything in an eerie green glow. We were trapped, surrounded by the spirits of the patients and the malevolent presence of Dr. Aldridge. The walkie-talkies crackled to life, the static filling the uneasy silence that had settled over us. "Guys, we need to stick together," I said, my voice shaking as I held the camera, its night vision casting everything in an eerie green glow. "Let's check the basement again," Marcus suggested. "There has to be more down there." We descended the rickety staircase, the smell of decay growing stronger with each step. The basement was a dark, oppressive space, filled with the remnants of Dr. Aldridge's experiments. Broken equipment, moldy patient records, and strange, unidentifiable stains covered every surface. As we fanned out, I kept the camera trained on the others. Evelyn and Marcus sifted through old medical journals, their faces pale in the glow of their flashlights. Rachel and Trevor were examining a rusted operating table, their expressions grim. "Evelyn, check this out," Marcus said, holding up a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and faded, but the name Dr. Aldridge was still legible. Evelyn flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. "These are more of his notes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was obsessed with immortality. He believed he could trap souls, use their energy to prolong his life. Guys," Rachel called out, "look at this." She pointed to a series of disturbing sketches pinned to the wall. They depicted patients in various stages of suffering, their faces twisted in agony. Each sketch was signed by Dr. Aldridge. "This guy was a psychopath," Trevor muttered. "No wonder this place is haunted." Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and the camera's lens fogged up. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed through the basement. I swung the camera around, trying to capture the source, but there was nothing, just shadows and darkness. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yeah," Marcus replied, gripping his flashlight tighter. "We're not alone down here." The sense of dread intensified. Objects started to move on their own, clattering to the floor. A shelf toppled over, scattering old medical supplies across the room. The camera caught it all, the chaos and the fear. Evelyn and Marcus continued to read through the journal, their faces growing more horrified with each page. "He did unspeakable things," Evelyn said. "He wasn't just experimenting, he was torturing them, trying to break their spirits." I focused the camera on a particularly gruesome passage. Dr. Aldridge had detailed his methods, describing how he would isolate patients, subject them to relentless pain and fear, all in the name of his twisted research. The room grew darker, the oppressive atmosphere almost suffocating. I felt a presence behind me and spun around, the camera capturing a fleeting glimpse of a ghostly figure, a young woman, her eyes filled with sorrow. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the camera lens before she vanished. "Evelyn, did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Yeah," she replied, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to help her. We need to set them free." As we gathered our findings, the walkie-talkies crackled again. "Guys, we need to get out of here," Trevor said, his voice filled with urgency. "This place is getting more dangerous by the minute." We nodded in agreement and began to make our way back to the stairs. But just as we reached the basement door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. I swung the camera around, its night vision revealing ghostly figures surrounding us, their faces twisted in agony and rage. The temperature dropped even further, and the sound of distant screams filled the air. We huddled together, the camera capturing our fear. "We need to find a way out," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here." Suddenly, the ground beneath us seemed to shift, and a hidden door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passage. "This way," Rachel said, leading the way. The passage was tight and claustrophobic, the walls damp and covered in mold. The air was thick with the smell of decay. The camera's light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As we moved deeper into the passage, we found ourselves in another room, this one filled with more of Dr. Aldridge's macabre experiments. Jars of preserved organs lined the shelves, and a large, blood-stained table stood in the center. "This is where he did it," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "This is where he broke them." The spirits grew more restless, their presence almost tangible. The camera caught glimpses of them, their forms shifting and flickering in the dim light. "Guys, look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside, we found more journals and a stack of old photographs. One of them showed Dr. Aldridge standing with his patients, their faces scratched out. "He trapped them here," I said, realization dawning. "He used their pain and suffering to bind their souls to this place." As we examined the photographs and journals, the oppressive feeling intensified. The spirits seemed to close in on us, their whispers growing louder. We needed to move, but as we turned to leave, the passage we had come through was no longer there. "Guys, the door is gone," Rachel exclaimed, panic rising in her voice. "Marcus, find another way," Trevor ordered, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." Marcus moved quickly, searching for another exit, but the spirits grew more aggressive. Objects flew through the air, and the temperature continued to drop. Suddenly, Marcus was yanked back by an unseen force, his scream echoing through the chamber. "Marcus!" Evelyn cried out, rushing to where he had stood just moments before. But he was gone, leaving only his walkie-talkie behind, the speaker crackling with static. "Help me. Please, help me." Marcus's voice came through the walkie-talkie, distorted and filled with fear. "We need to get out of here," Trevor said, his voice shaking. "We can't help him if we're dead." We began to search frantically for another way out, the camera capturing our desperation and the rising sense of doom. Rachel was the next to vanish. One moment she was with us, the next she was gone, her terrified screams echoing through the halls. We rushed toward the sound, but it quickly faded, leaving only an eerie silence behind. I aimed the camera's flickering light down the corridor where she had disappeared. On the ground, her camera lay abandoned, still recording, but there was no sign of her. "Evelyn, Trevor, we need to stick together," I said, my voice trembling with fear and determination. The spirits seemed to sense our growing desperation and fear. Their malevolent presence intensified, the air growing colder and thicker with each passing moment. Objects began to fly through the air, propelled by unseen forces. Books, medical instruments, and debris crashed against the walls and floor, creating a cacophony of chaos. Shadows danced menacingly along the walls, morphing into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out for us. We fought our way through the asylum, the camera capturing every horrifying moment. Our breaths came in ragged gasps as we stumbled over the decaying remnants of the once institutionalized horrors. Each step felt like wading through a nightmare that grew more vivid and terrifying with every second. In a final, desperate bid for survival, we reached the main hall. The doors loomed ahead of us, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. As we approached, a chilling realization hit us. The doors were locked and the windows barred. There was no way out. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat that echoed the urgency of our situation. The camera's battery was dying, its light flickering ominously. Shadows closed in around us, the spirit's anger palpable and suffocating. Their whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a sinister chant that filled the air with dread. "Evelyn, we need to find another way out," I said, my voice filled with a determination that barely masked my fear. "We can't give up." But before we could move, a sense of profound malevolence washed over us. The ghostly figure of Dr. Aldridge materialized before us. His face twisted into a malevolent grin that chilled me to the bone. His eyes were empty, dark voids that seemed to suck the light and hope from the room. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice echoing through the hall like a death knell. "This is your new home." The camera captured our final moments, the red light blinking as we faced the nightmare that was Hollow Creek Asylum. Dr. Aldridge's presence seemed to suck the life out of the air, making it hard to breathe. Shadows swirled around him, the spirits of the tormented patients drawn to his malevolent power. Spectral hands reached out from the darkness, grabbing Trevor and pulling him off his feet. His eyes widened in terror, and he let out a blood-curdling scream as he was dragged away. His voice echoed down the hallway as he disappeared into the shadows. Trevor! I shouted, but he was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. Evelyn was the next. The spectral hands grasped her from all sides, dragging her into the void. She screamed, her voice filled with terror and despair. "Jonah, help me!" she cried, but the spirit's grip was unrelenting. I lunged forward, trying to reach her, but it was too late. She was pulled into the darkness, her screams echoing through the asylum. Now alone, I found myself surrounded by the spirits of the patients, their faces twisted in eternal agony. Their eyes were filled with sorrow and rage, a testament to the suffering they had endured at the hands of Dr. Aldridge. They closed in on me, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I backed into a corner, the camera shaking in my trembling hands. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. I knew that escape was impossible, but a primal instinct drove me to try. I lunged toward the door, but the spirits were faster. Their cold, spectral hands grasped me, pulling me back into the darkness. My last hope of escape faded. The spirits closed in, their faces filled with rage and despair. Their voices surrounded me, a chorus of suffering and anger. I was trapped, caught in an endless cycle of horror and suffering. Somewhere in the darkness, Marcus, Rachel, Trevor, and Evelyn were waiting, their voices calling out for help that would never come. I could hear them, faint and distant, their pleas blending with the whispers of the other lost souls. Years had passed since we vanished within the walls of Hollow Creek Asylum, but the building's malevolent presence remained unchanged. It stood, a dark monument to eternal suffering, casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. The locals still whispered about the asylum, warning those who dared to listen. Yet curiosity is a powerful force, and it wasn't long before another group of thrill-seekers ventured into the cursed halls. The new explorers were a group of college students, eager to document their findings and share their adventure online. They arrived at dusk, their laughter and excitement a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that surrounded the asylum. Among them was a young woman named Lisa, who carried a high-end camera, determined to capture every moment of their exploration. "Look at this place," one of them, Jake, said, his voice echoing through the empty courtyard. "It's even creepier than I imagined." "Let's head inside and get some footage," Lisa suggested, her eyes glinting with excitement and a touch of fear. They pushed open the rusted gates and stepped into the asylum, the air immediately growing colder, heavier. The shadows seemed to stretch and reach out, as if welcoming them into the depths of the building. The group moved cautiously, their flashlights casting narrow beams of light that barely penetrated the darkness. As they explored the decaying hallways, they stumbled upon a large, dilapidated room. In the center of the room, half buried under debris, was an old video camera, its surface coated in dust and grime. "Hey, look at this," Lisa called out, picking up the camera. She brushed off the dirt, revealing a red light blinking weakly. "It's still working." "That's impossible," Jake said, peering over her shoulder. "This thing looks ancient." Lisa turned on the camera and rewound the footage. The group huddled around, their expressions shifting from curiosity to horror as they watched. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy, haunting images of the previous explorers. Us. They saw Marcus, Rachel, Trevor, Evelyn, and me documenting our terrifying experiences within the asylum. "This is messed up," one of the students whispered, their eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave." But Lisa, captivated by the footage, continued to watch. The camera revealed our final moments, the desperate struggles, the screams, the ghostly figures closing in. The screen went black as the battery died, but the eerie silence that followed was even more chilling. "Did you hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. The group fell silent, straining to listen. Faint whispers echoed through the hallways, growing louder and more insistent. "Let's get out of here," Jake said, his voice filled with urgency. But as they turned to leave, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. trapping them inside forever.